Well, shares of chip makers are down broadly today after China restricted the exports of metals that are critical to manufacturing semiconductors. The new rules specifically target gallium and germanium, and it comes months after the U.S. imposed sweeping restrictions, all but banning shipments of advanced chips to China. And of course, it comes as Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen prepares to visit Beijing. Here to discuss further, let's bring in Charles Kupchan, professor of international affairs at Georgetown University and senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Always good to have you on the show. Talk to me about the timing of all of this, these restrictions being announced just days before Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is set to make the trip.
Well, the U.S. and China are in a bit of a dance here, where the relationship was in the freezer basically since the U.S. shoot down of the Chinese balloon that drifted across the United States. Blinken, Secretary of State, his trip to Beijing was canceled. Finally, it was put back on the schedule. He went a couple of weeks ago. Now Janet Yellen is going in an attempt to restart the dialogue. But the relationship is in a very difficult place right now. And just in advance of this trip, we're seeing, number one, the Chinese say export controls on these metals that you use in advanced chips. The United States, we're now hearing, is about to restrict the access of Chinese companies to cloud computing as a potential backdoor to getting advanced access to AI and these kinds of things. So she's going at a time when the relationship is fraught. I think there's a willingness on both sides to try to push the conversation as a positive direction, but it's going to be real. It's going to be an uphill battle.
Specifically on these critical metals. I mean, we have seen China do this before around rare earth minerals many, many years ago. How critical are these metals that have been mentioned? And what's your assessment of the impact this is likely to have, at least within the chip making space as well as the solar space?
Well, I think that the Chinese have seen the U.S. announcement about restricting access to high-end chips and chip-making machines as a sign that the United States wants to contain China and prevent its rise, prevent it from economic growth, keep it 2-3 steps behind the United States. And they see this as, in many respects, not an act of war, but a real sign that the U.S.-China relationship is headed in a very negative direction. And as a consequence, they're trying to begin to push back. They're saying, if you restrict our access to high-end chips, we're going to restrict the access of the metals that you need to make those chips. And I think what we're seeing here is the two sides feeling each other out about how far this tit-for-tat game is going to go. The National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, has said small yard, high fence. That is to say, we're going to restrict a relatively small number of technologies, but we're going to make sure the Chinese can't get them. The big question right now is it going to turn into big field high fence? Is there going to be a snowballing effect where the U.S. and the Chinese economies begin to effectively decouple? We're not there yet, but that in some ways is the $6 million question. And the Chinese announcement about restricting the export of these metals, I think, is a sign that we are heading in that direction.
You highlighted a number of issues that are on the table in the Treasury Secretary's visit to Beijing. Do these latest restrictions that have been announced from China, does that give Beijing a little more leverage in these talks?
Well, I think both sides are trying to set the table here. I don't think it's an accident that the Wall Street Journal reported that in this new announcement, this new rule that's going to be coming out later this year from the Biden administration, that it will include potentially restrictions on access to cloud computing. The Chinese, I don't think, accidentally announced that they're going to restrict the export of these critical metals. In some ways, both sides are jockeying. They are trying to get the upper hand in this conversation. And I think, we know from history that you got to get the geopolitics right if you're going to get the economics right? You can't solve U.S.-China tension by Janet Yellen making a breakthrough here or breakthrough there on trade. But I do think what we're seeing here is that two sides begin to engage in a conversation that's aimed at trying to put a floor beneath the tension, trying to prevent the further slide in US-China relations. Right now, it's simply too soon to tell. Both sides are taking tough measures against the other, not making concessions and showing signs of moving toward more cooperation.
Where do you think this leaves other countries that are US allies and big players, particularly in the chip space? I mean, South Korea, for example, has really shown that they're a little uneasy in having to take sides in either direction.
Well, so far the United States has gotten the Netherlands and Japan to cooperate on this chip restriction. I think the bigger question is Europe, is South Korea, is Japan, are these other countries that have major trade relationships with China going to agree to go down the road of some significant measure of decoupling with China? And at this point, I don't think we know the answer to that. I do think that the Europeans in particular are uncomfortable with the prospect of an escalation in a trade war. Germany's main trading partner is China. Its car companies have big business in China. And so I think right now the sides are feeling each other out, and the United States is trying to pull Europe in its direction. But so too are the Chinese worried about the erosion of their relationship with Europe. And that relationship has taken a serious southward turn because of the war in Ukraine and China's backing of Russia in that war. Right now, I think the Chinese are on a bit of a charm offensive with Europe, and not just with Europe. They're trying to get more involved in Middle East diplomacy, brokering a deal for rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So I think that the Chinese strategy here is to try to isolate the United States, keep good relationships with the global South, with the Europeans in particular, at a time when the relationship with the U.S. seems to be going in a more difficult direction.
And finally, Charles, so many of these restrictions, or at least verbal warnings, have been around the tech space. We talked about concerns around data sharing, cloud computing, AI, semiconductors, and materials there. Does this go beyond that? Is there a risk of that, or is this largely contained to tech because of the competition and then the ramifications of tech being transferred in either direction?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think for now, this is, as Jake Sullivan puts it, a small field. It's restricted to high-end technology. It's restricted to technologies that if the Chinese military got its hands on it, it could put it in a position to become a more serious competitor of the United States in a geopolitical sense. We know that during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union had effectively no commercial relationship, a fracture in the global economy. We now live in a much more interdependent world in which the US, Europe, many countries in the global South are deeply integrated into the Chinese economy, going back to a global fracture in which you don't just decouple in a minimal way, but you deglobalize. That would wreak havoc on the international economy. And that's why I think everybody's watching carefully to see whether this tit for tat that we see between the US and China now stays restricted in the realm of AI and high-end semiconductors, or begins to broaden to other sectors. That, I think, is the key question. We won't know the answer because right now both sides are feeling each other out.
Okay, well, we'll all be watching for any developments coming out of the Treasury Secretary's visit there. Charles Kupchan, Georgetown University professor and member of Council on Foreign Relations, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.